Hannah Page I just finished the postdoc research at the University of Pisa, working for a project called Process, and now she can tell a bit more about what she did in this project, because this is a project to study, to analyze the social history of ancient Egypt, that is led by University of Pisa, and she had the PhD at UCL in analysis of pottery, X-ray analysis of pottery. And then the second speaker will be Arianna Sacco. She did her MA in Napoli, L'Orientale, right? And then the PhD was carried out in Leiden, and now she's postdoc at the Austrian Archaeological Institute in Vienna. Okay, so I give just the word to Mattia.
Sì, buongiorno a tutti, anch'io vado molto velocemente, giusto per presentarvi un po' l'associazione Volo. Così come i seminari Est, anche Volo torna attiva quest'anno dopo uno stop dovuto al Covid, e lo fa con questi seminari. L'associazione Volo è un'associazione studentesca fondata più di 10 anni fa da studenti di Egittologia, ma non solo, con lo scopo di portare agli studenti attività varie, attività culturali, ma anche ludiche, come conferenze, viaggi in tutta Europa, ma non solo, corsi e anche concerti, feste varie. Per noi è sempre stato un piacere dare una mano all'Egittologia pisana, usufruendo dei finanziamenti che l'Università garantisce alle associazioni studentesche per finanziare questi seminari. Quindi cominciamo quest'anno con finanziamento di questa attività di oggi e poi continueremo il 19 e 20 con le altre che il professore Mignaci ha annunciato. Non vorrei far perdere tempo ulteriore, quindi comincerei. We'll start. Yeah.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the project I did here in Pisa, where I was doing some analysis of clay figurines, usually unfired clay figurines. So the title of my talk is Chemical Analysis of Clay Figurines from the Egyptian Middle Kingdom. So as some of you will be aware, I worked as part of the Process project, which was led by Gianluca. The project in general focuses on developing a social history of ordinary people in ancient Egypt. And this included an in-depth study of unfired or low-fired figurines. And these are mainly from domestic, non-elite contexts. But as you'll see, some of them I've looked at were from more funerary contexts. So the idea was to explore the chaîne opératoire, or the production sequence of these figurines, and this involved looking at the technology and the fingerprints. This analysis was carried out by Vanessa Forte before me, but then I came in to look at the point before the artifacts get made. So essentially, I'm looking at the steps involved in the decisions and steps involved in the formation of choosing the raw materials, so raw material selection, and the manipulation of those raw materials as well. Okay, so basically the decisions made at the beginning of a process of making a figurine can be made for a number of different reasons. So the clay selection, for example, can be made for functional reasons. So, you know, the material might be chosen for its strength or its porosity. It may be made for aesthetic reasons, such as the color, the texture, maybe the way that a mineral catches the light, for example. Also could be chosen for practical reasons. So the proximity of the clay source to where the producer lives. Also, it could be because of just traditionally held beliefs. So it could be the idea that maybe a certain material is better. It can be a mixture of all of these as well. So it's really hard to untangle why someone has used a particular raw material or group of raw materials. And also, it can be really entangled with just how somebody was taught to do something. So some people may have forgotten why they choose certain materials because they were just taught to do it in a certain way. So by examining the clay composition, or the chemical composition of the clay, the geological characteristics of the raw materials can be better understood. So this information can be used to suggest probable provenance, and also therefore answer questions pertaining to the location of production, and also then the distribution of artifacts after they've been made and deposited. So the chemical composition of a clay object is not only determined by the materials, but it's also determined by the individual technological aspects that have been put into making that clay paste. So the addition of temper, for example, the taking out of certain materials. So if there's lots of chaff in something and they take those out, this can all be affected in the chemical composition. So I used a couple of different methods. The materials I was looking at could not be destructively sampled. So I was using a couple of different methods to look at the fabric of the figurines. The first was using a dynalite microscope, and this was able to look much closer at the fabric paste, pick out certain minerals or certain inclusions that kind of were able to be seen under the dynalite. And the second was using a portable energy dispersive X-ray fluorescence. So just go back to that for a second. Portable X-ray energy dispersive X-ray fluorescence is used for composition analysis, and it's useful for determining artifacts that have been made the same or made differently. So it helps to show patterning, whether things are similar or different, basically. And this is as well for indicating the type of raw materials that have been used to make a particular object. So it's also been shown in studies that the differences in fabric composition, as I said just previously, can also be due to the technological choices made by the producer during paste preparation, and these are identifiable chemically as well. So detecting the differences and similarities in the composition of the clay is paramount for the identification of technological traditions, and which may represent specific or specialized craft technologies, for example, that might be associated with a time, a place, or an object type. So for my project, I looked at artifacts, not just figurines, but artifacts from 4 different sites. 2 of those were in Lower Egypt. There's the pyramid town of Lahun. The objects were kept at the Petrie Museum in London. The second was the site of Lisht, which were held in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And then I also looked at 2 fortress sites in Nubia, and these are Buhen, also in the Petrie Museum, and Uranati, which is in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So quickly, I just want to run through the types of materials that we found at the different sites. So in the Petrie Museum in London, as we know, it's in the Fayoum region. It's a pyramid town. And we have lots of different types of figurines found here. So we have zoomorphic figurines such as crocodiles, quadrupeds like pig, sheep, cattle. We then have anthropomorphic figurines, both male and female. We have these clay discs that are kind of got perforations in them, which have been identified as being clay heads or stylized heads. We then have different models of different things such as sarcophagi, boats, and then I also decided to analyze a few of the clay ceilings with stamp seal impressions as well, as these are made out of clay. And then also to get some comparisons with other objects, other unfired objects at the site. I also looked at the famous rat trap that was found in Lahun, a gaming board and a gaming piece as well. So in total, there was 109 artifacts that I looked at. Unfortunately, only 85 of those could be analysed by PXRF, and there's lots of reasons for this, which I'll talk about later. So the second site I looked at, again, this collection was in the Petrie Museum, is the fortress site of Buhen in Lower Nubia. Again, we have zoomorphic figurines, there's birds, there's a fish, camel, horse, also anthropomorphic figurines. And the anthropomorphic figurines tend to be these female block type figurines, and there was quite a significant number of those in the collection. I also then decided to look at other objects as well from the site, and these included these interesting objects here, which are described as missiles. They're these lozenge-shaped objects, which are unfired as well. And then also these ones here, which again have been described as mace heads, also mainly unfired. So from Behen, I looked at 45 artifacts in total, and 44 of these could be analysed by PXRF. So from Uranati, again, fortress site in Nubia, again, we have zoomorphic figurines, crocodile, hippos, birds, quadrupeds. There's a scorpion as well down here. We have anthropomorphic male and female figurines. This is a really interesting male figurine, which is kind of smoking something, I think, or eating something. It's quite nice. And there was 27 artifacts in total, and all of those could be studied by PXRF. So that was good. So the final site, and this is kind of the slightly different site that I looked at, was Lisht. As many of you may know, it's a pyramid. There's a pyramid complex or a couple of pyramid complexes on the site. There's an acropolis with these cemeteries, lower north and south cemeteries. And there's also some town context, some habitation context as well. The majority of the artifacts from this came from more funerary context. So they were found in cemeteries. So this is a bit of a different site than the ones the other ones that I looked at. So from this site, again, we have some zoomorphic figurines. So we have some quadrupeds, we have this kind of crocodile down here. We have some anthropomorphic, mainly female figurines. And then we also have these really interesting ones down here. So these are stylized, well, what I described as stylized zoomorphic figurines. And they've got these embedded faience beads all over the surfaces. And they're quite distinctive looking. And there was 5 of those in total that I looked at. So there was 23 artifacts I looked at in total from the site. Unfortunately, because the Met has quite strict rules about looking at certain artifacts, I was only able to PXRF 13 of these, which was a shame, but I still think that the data I've got is okay. So the analysis undertaken at the museum, well, in total, I looked at 202 artifacts, which is quite a good number for the study. So I've got a good kind of understanding of these different sites. And it involved a 5-stage process. So the first stage was taking photographs. I then also took macroscopic observations about the technology, and this was to help other members of the team to reconstruct kind of the chain repertoire. I then also took the dynalite photographs. So this is the dynalite down here, taking those of the clay fabric so I could identify major inclusions. I then took photographs of any fingerprints that were found in the clay. So a lot of these, because they're unfired and because they're just being made by hand, they've got these fingerprint impressions still in them. So we took photographs of the fingerprints, and Vanessa Forte was one of the things she was doing, and she's just published a paper with Gianluca about it, was looking at these figurines and trying to figure out who the makers might be. So the PXRF was the final step, and you can see that it's set up down here. For each object, I tried to take 2 or 3 different points on each object. Now, this is because, as many of you will know, clay is heterogeneous in its composition. So if you want to try and get a more holistic view of the composition of the artifact, you need to take multiple spots. Unfortunately, these objects are quite small, so sometimes it's hard to take many more samples than that. And also, some of them are not as flat as you would like. You need to take measurements on flatter surfaces. So ones that are really kind of concave or convex are quite difficult to take accurate measurements of. And also the other issue is that some objects will have post-depositional or calcite leaching on the surfaces. Also, they might have been painted, and these things will interfere with our understanding of the actual composition of the artifact. So they're all things that we need to take into consideration. So I also took geological standards with me, and I measured these throughout the processes. And this is to understand how well the machine is performing during the analysis. And then that is used afterwards when you're analysing the data. So in total, I managed to look at 169 clay and ceramic artifacts with portable X-ray fluorescence. And that's mainly what I'm going to be talking about today. So thinking about the questions I wanted to ask. the main objective of the analysis was to gain an understanding of the use of raw materials for making unfired or low-fired clay figurines. So one particular question was whether the makers of the figurines were selecting a particular type of clay, or was this more random? The second was whether clay choice changed for different types of figurines, maybe between zoomorphic or anthropomorphic objects, for example. Were they using the same clays as ceramics? I took a number of, from La Hun, I also took a number of ceramic samples as well. So I wanted to see if they're maybe using the same kind of materials. And then once you have the provenance, or we can kind of assess the provenance, do we have any movement of these artifacts? Are they being made there? Are they being made elsewhere and moved? Is there any evidence of trade? And then also, do we have any difference between the Nubian and the Egyptian material as well? So these are all kind of interesting questions that I wanted to try and answer. Now it's going to be a bit technical, but it'll be quick. So I had to use two different portable X-ray PXRF machines, basically. So I used one that's here in Pisa, and I also used one that was loaned to me from UCL. So I used the UCL one for the ones in the Petrie Museum, and then I took the Pisa PXRF to the States. So the Pisa machine was an Olympus. They're both Olympus Vanta X-ray fluorescence analyzers, but they're slightly different, and this is important. You'll see why in a second. So the first one from Pisa was an Olympus Vanta C series. It had a two-beam geochemical method, so it's firing two beams at the object, and it was collecting data on 34 elements. Each of those beams was taking measurements for 60 seconds, so I had a total total analytical amount of 120 seconds in total. The UCL was slightly different. It was an M series machine, and it had a three-beam geochemical method, which meant that it's slightly more accurate for certain elements. It can look at certain elements a bit better. But I used 60 seconds for each of those beams as well, and that gave me a total of 180 seconds. So yes, I'll go into some of this in a bit more detail now. Again, sorry about the detail and the small writing on this, but before the two machines, I could analyze any of the data from the two machines, they had to be aligned so that the data can be used together. Because they're two different machines, they're being used in very different circumstances, and they have different capabilities. So if you want to use the data together, you have to align it. So to do this, I first checked the precision and accuracy measurements on both machines. And those elements that had poor accuracy or poor precision, I had to discount straight away. And this left me with 12 elements for this alignment process. So I put together these, you can see here, these are linear regressions, and these help to see how well the two machines are performing in relation to one another. And it was pretty obvious quite quickly that the Pisa machine was actually performing better on more elements. It is a newer machine, so I think that might have something to do with it. So from these calibrations, from these linear regressions I was doing here, I was able to generate correction factors and apply these correction factors to the UCL data. And then with that, you then have this aligned data that can be used when studying all the material together. And this left me with 5 elements: alumina, silica, iron, zinc, and strontium. So these 5 elements could be used when comparing the two sites. However, if I was looking at a site individually, I could use different elements, because the two machines did perform better on certain elements. So I can get into this a bit later when I talk about specific examples. So after this calibration and accuracy measurements, the data was treated in a couple of different ways. First thing I had to do was normalize the data. And this just helps to account for oxygen, which isn't measured when you are analyzing using PXRF. So it helps to kind of, you can see here, you've got oxides. It helps to work out the oxides, and you have to do conversions to, just to basically normalize and kind of make the data more usable. And this data was used for descriptive statistics. So looking at relative amounts of different elements in the samples, and also for elemental biplots as well. After that, I then had to transform the data again, and I used a centered log ratio. And this is to try and draw out any archaeologically meaningful patterning in the data set, essentially. And this was used for multivariate statistics. So I used a couple of methods, principal components analysis and also hierarchical cluster analysis. And this will help to identify significant groups and things that might kind of suggest patterning in my data. Right, so here are some of the results. So this plot here shows the principal components analysis that was taken using the centered log ratio data that I just mentioned. And as you can see, we have this main cluster here, and we have a number of outliers over here. Now, if we look at the component plot on this side, we can see what is affecting these groups. So all of these outliers are mostly being affected by zinc and strontium. And this group up here by kind of iron, alumina, and silica. When we look a bit closer, and we kind of, I've highlighted the different sites on the graph as well. We can see that these three outliers at the bottom here are all from Liszt. I can tell you that they are these interesting clay lumps that I called them. So these are the only objects that weren't technically kind of a figurine or another type of object. These were basically clay lumps, but they have these embedded faience beads in them, and they were found in a faience workshop, or something that's been coined a faience workshop at Liszt. So I analysed these, and I thought this would be quite interesting to see, because this may represent more of a raw material. So seeing how this related to my other data was going to be quite interesting. And as we can see here, these are very different from everything else that I looked at. They're really heavily being pulled in this direction by strontium down here. So I couldn't use I unfortunately couldn't use calcite calcium when I was studying both of the machines together, because it didn't perform as well. But when I looked at the data just from Liszt, the calcium accuracy was quite good on the Pisa machine, so I could look at it briefly. And it's important, calcium is really important here because it's a really strong indicator of clay type in Egypt. I'll explain why in a second. But what's important to note here is that these three clay samples, have up to 5 times more calcium in them than any of the other objects. And this is directly reflected in the amount of strontium that is in these artifacts as well. Now, the reason for this is because calcium and strontium are both major components, or the major components in calcite. And so looking at one is usually a direct influence of the other. So strontium can often be used as a proxy for calcium in objects, in analyses where you can't actually measure calcium. So this is going to be really useful for my data, because I can use the strontium reading to let me know if I think that there is calcite present or calcium present, and thus calcite. So here we can see we've got these high calcium and strontium, hence high calcite. So yeah, so that's just a really interesting thing to note here. So it's important, calcite is particularly important because of, it's a major component in one of the 2 major clay sources, types of clay that is used in Egypt. We generally have 2 main clay types that are used, and these are Nile silts from the Nile Valley and the Nile floodplain. And these are up and down the entire length of the Nile. The other type is marl clay. Now, marl clay is not found as widely. It's mainly found from just below Cairo and until about Esna. So that's the main kind of source of it. So the sites of Blahun and Liszt would have had good sources of marl clay nearby, but whereas the Uranati and Buhen samples would not have had any kind of good sources of marl clay nearby to them. So marl clay, as I hinted at earlier, is calcareous. So it's rich in it's got heavy amounts of calcite in it. It's rich, therefore, in calcium and also in strontium. And it has much, as a reflection, it also has much less iron in it. Nile clay, on the other hand, tends to have much higher iron content, also higher silica as well. So we can kind of use these parameters as an indication of what types of clays are being used when we're looking at the compositional data. So this graph is an adapted one from the one we saw on the last graph, but I've excluded those major outliers. So those really major outliers, including those clay lumps, I've excluded. And this is so you can get a more detailed view on the main cluster here. So again, we can see that we have this like main cluster really clustered together in the right side of the graph over here. Now this, I think, because of this up here, the higher iron, silica, and alumina, that this is probably representing artifacts that are made from Nile silts. On the other hand, these ones down here have a much higher strontium content, and thus calcium, and thus calcite. So major component in marl clay is calcite. So I'm thinking that these ones down here are most likely to be made up mostly of marl clay. So then what about these ones in the middle? Well, one hypothesis is that this may be representing more of a mixed group. So marl clay may be mixed with Nile silts. Now this could be a natural mixing, it could be an intentional mixing, but also it could also mean using an Nile silt or a marl clay and then adding something else to the mixture, so adding temper. So I'll talk about this again a bit more later on. Okay, so now I'm just going to return to the first principal components plot, which had all of the outliers in it. And I just want to look at what those artifacts actually are. So many of them are from Lahun, as you can see. So I've highlighted all the Lahun samples on here and shown some of the outliers as well. So the Lahun outliers include these two samples here, which are both birds. And they are showing very high strontium content. So, and just the appearance of them as well, looking at them under a dynolite, they are definitely calcareous. They're most likely being, marl clay is most definitely being used to produce them. We then have a number of the fired ceramics that I looked at from Lahun as well. So they include these cups and plates and stand as well, offering stand. Now with fired ceramics, their composition will change when they're fired. So it isn't unusual to find them differing slightly in these compositional charts when the rest of the material is unfired. So it's not a massive surprise, but what I thought was really interesting actually is that all three of these materials, of these objects, are quite different. So even in ceramics, it doesn't seem there is very much consistency going on in the type of clay being used, which I thought was an interesting takeaway. So there's a couple of other samples that were major outliers. This included the rat trap down here. However, as you can see on the surface of the rat trap, it's got this white kind of layer on the outside, which was its ancient plaster. And I'm pretty sure that that's what this analysis is picking up. I think it's picking up this plaster. You can be as careful as you like with the analysis, but sometimes it's quite hard to find a place on the object where it doesn't have this outside layer. So I think we're getting this layer rather than the actual fabric of the object. Also, we have this gaming board up here, which is much higher quantities of iron. And then finally, we have at the bottom here, this one object from Buchen, which is a so-called fish figurine. But again, as you can see, we have this white layer on the outside, and this is a white incrustation, which is from post-depositional context. So I think this is either kind of calcite leaching or just a reflection of where this material was in the ground. Okay, so now we want to try and establish groups within the main cluster that we see here. So again, here I've excluded those major outliers. And we can see that here we have this main cluster, but I want to look at some of these groups outlying it. So the first one here is a very interesting group. We have those two bird figurines that we saw earlier from Lahun, and we also have 4 out of the 5 stylized zoomorphic figurines from Liszt, which have these faience beads embedded in them. This group over here, this cluster I've named number 2, have much higher strontium, but also higher iron as well. But they have similar alumina, slightly higher zinc, and slightly lower silica than the main cluster. And I think that this might suggest that they are mixing both marl and Nile silts, because we have both high strontium and also high iron in these as well. And you can see some of the figurines that are represented in this group over here. Oh, lost it. Oh, okay. Okay, and then we have these two groups, number 3 and 4, over here. So these figurines have much higher iron and much lower silica. This indicates that the clay being used has a higher iron and lower silica component. Again, probably indicative of more similar to a Nile silt, especially definitely a non-calcareous clay. But again, they seem to differ from this main cluster. So perhaps it's a Nile clay or a similar deposit, or maybe it's a Nile clay being mixed with something else that's causing this difference. And I'll talk about this a bit more later. Right, so when we look at the scatter plot here, and I've just highlighted the different sites on here, so you can kind of clearly see how things are grouping. What is clear is that there is a clear, we have clear outliers, like I said, but we have outliers from all sites, but mostly, mostly we have these, sorry, where is it? Can't find my second. Laser. Yeah, here we go. So most of these outliers over here are Licht, from Licht. So Licht is definitely very different from the rest of the samples. And that's, really, really important for this analysis. The second thing I want to point out is that Uranati and Buchen, they cluster very tightly together in this right-hand side of the chart, suggesting that they are quite similar. Lahun, again, clusters within this main cluster, but more to the left, and it does have some significant outliers over here. So it's a broader geochemical spread that suggests there might be a bit more variety in the use of raw materials that they're using here. So when we look at the kind of values that we're getting kind of from the sites, these are kind of mean values of different elements, we can see and start to understand why this patterning is happening. So Licht, we can see it has a lot higher silica, which is really interesting, but it also importantly has much higher strontium than all of the other artifacts from the other sites. Also higher zinc, and zinc's really important because it's a trace element, and this is very useful for provenancing. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Buchen and Uranati are very similar. You can see their kind of mean amounts are quite similar. And Lahun, again, a bit different. We have the highest quantity of iron happening in the Lahun samples, and also the highest amounts of alumina. So when we're looking at kind of this data, we want to then also look at kind of elemental biplots, so we can clearly see how this patterning is being affected by these elements that we just saw in the mean chart. So major elements such as iron, calcium, and alumina are most important for investigating the different types of clay or clay minerals being used. So in this case, they're obviously key to distinguishing between marl and Nile clays. And again, here we can see when we look at iron versus strontium over here, that these clay lumps very clearly are much higher in strontium and are in the lower quartile of iron. So again, most likely this is marl clay that's being used for these lumps, basically. So again, we have, if we look down here, I've taken away these kind of major outliers, and we're looking at strontium and iron again. And we can see that the Uranati and Buchen material, again, clusters quite closely together at the bottom here, quite low in strontium values. The Lahun material has a wider spread, but most of it is also clustering with this other material. And you can just make out here, these Licht materials are outliers. And here I've kind of highlighted some of them on here. Okay, so rather than trace major elements that can help distinguish between different clay minerals, trace elements can help determine different clay sources, or the provenance, basically. So when you have two similar sources that are quite close together, so say two sedimentary sources that are quite close together, but they're different outcrops. The way that you would distinguish between the two would be using the trace elements, because they'll have fairly similar major elements because they're made up of a similar type of clay. But it's the trace elements that will be able to distinguish exactly which deposit they were taken from. So again, we see Buchen, Uranati clustering tightly together, because these are using the two trace elements I have, strontium and zinc. Lahun is also similar, but has many of these outliers. And again, Lisht clearly is outlying. It's a bit difficult to see on this chart, but yeah, we see Lisht here, and up here as well. So clearly, you know, Lisht artifacts are different. Okay, so after looking at what elements were causing the different groupings and how these related to different archaeological sites, I wanted to look at any patterning within the types of materials, the types of figurines, so zoomorphic versus anthropomorphic. Looking at this chart, we've got anthropomorphic in the blue and zoomorphic in orange. It's a pretty mixed bag. It's some possible groupings, but there doesn't seem to be anything really significant, except maybe this group down here, which are all zoomorphic figurines. So when we look at things in a bit more detail, so this is now highlighting exactly what those objects are, we can see that we have, again, those stylized zoomorphic figurines from Lisht down here. Next to those are those, what I would say are marl birds from Lahun. But then we also do start to see some other patterning as well. So over here, we've got a lot of these blue triangles, which are representing anthropomorphic heads. It's possible that this is significant. It's something I need to look into more, but they do seem to be clustering down here. And that's potentially interesting. And that includes most of them from Lahun, but one from Buchen, which is this one here. The other really interesting thing was with crocodile figurines. So up here, we have these yellow triangles. They are all crocodile figurines, and they're mostly, again, from Lahun, but we also have one from Uranati and one from Lisht as well. And they are clustering outside of the main compositional group over here to the left-hand side. So there's definitely potentially something interesting going on here with these crocodile figurines. So I want to take a look a bit closely at these crocodile figurines. So we can see that they are majority are found outside the main cluster. Four of them do remain within it. So I mean, it's not unanimous across all the crocodile figurines, but there is a large enough group of them to suggest there is something interesting going on in the terms of raw material choice. Many of the ones in this top area that you can see up here have a red-brown appearance, which suggests the presence of Nile clay. And this is corroborated in the geochemistry, which suggests that these all have much higher iron content. But we also see that they have comparatively lower silica readings as well. So that's caused by quartz. So maybe, you know, quartz could be being taken out. It could be being removed. There's different reasons for why this might be. It could also just be the raw material. What's particularly interesting, though, is that two of these figurines, and the ones that you can see on the screen now, one of them from Lahun, which is this one up here, and this one from Uranati, had large quantities of the mineral mica on the surfaces. And these are on the outside surfaces. Interestingly, for this one, they are mainly on the top of the figurine. So here you can see this mica on the head of the crocodile. So mica is very reflective. And when it's moved in the light, it can appear kind of gold and glittery. So it's, you know, it's quite striking. This can also be seen a bit better here under the dynalite, and you can see these mica, pieces of mica. They're very, very kind of striking, golden appearance. When you move the crocodile around in your hand, you can see this mica kind of glittering, you know. So as these were the only two that I found with mica on them, and they're both crocodile figurines, it's hard to think that there wasn't some intentionality here into the adding of mica. because I think it would need to be intentionally added. It's not something that I see. I do see mica in other samples, but not in the same quantities and the same kind of intentionality of putting it on certain parts of the object. So therefore, we've got to consider the fact that this was a conscious choice was being made to add the mica to these crocodile figurines. And it might suggest there's a couple of different possibilities that I've come up with, that maybe they're trying to imitate the scales of a crocodile, for example. There might be another symbolic reason for this. Either way, it was a decision that was clearly made by the maker in the raw material selection stage, but also in the preparation of the raw materials. Clay wasn't simply taken out of the ground as it was found and used. There was some thought that was gone into it, and it was added. So anyone else who's got any thoughts on this, I'd be very interested if you had any insights. But yeah, I need to look more into this. Okay, so I want to quickly look at some of the other objects that I looked at. So these were the missiles and those mace heads from Buhen. As we can see in the graph here, it's quite difficult to see, but they're these kind of grey squares, and where are the others? The missiles are these kind of black dots. They seem to fit quite neatly within the other objects we found from Buhen. They have a similar composition, so it suggests they're using the same clay for these. The clay ceilings that I found, that I looked at from La Hun, a couple of them we see out here, a couple of them we see within the main cluster. And this suggests that there's no real consistency in use of materials for these clay ceilings, which is interesting. But some of them are using the same clay that they've used for the figurines in general. Okay, so I want to briefly return now to the figurines from Liszt, because there are some really interesting patternings that are happening here. So these are interesting because they're mostly found in, like I said, in non-habitation contexts, but in the north and south cemeteries of Liszt. And this is the data when I looked at only the Liszt material. Again, we can see these three clay lumps clearly outlying out here. We also see over here, when we're looking at iron and calcium, that we have these zoomorphic figurines clearly outlying as well. But in general, most of the objects from Liszt have higher calcite in general as well. Okay. All of them have this generally higher calcium and strontium than the others that we see. So I would suggest that the clay lumps, which were found in the faience workshop, are most likely pure marl, which is being used in some way in the faience production, or in the workshop at least, because they're found there, and there's also context within this workshop where they found large quantities of this kind of marl type material. However, we can see clearly that the other figurines from the site are not being made with pure marl, because they would cluster very closely to these clay lumps. So this suggests that they are using marl. There is a high marl component, but they're also mixing it with something else, which is most likely going to be Nile silts. When we look at the dynamite images, we can really clearly see that there is a very high calcium component to these figurines from Liszt. These are all kind of very white in color. You can see kind of calcite inclusions. It's very, very clear. And this is particularly clear when you compare these dynamite photographs with one of a object or figurine from Buhen. Much more red in color, not calcareous, very, very clearly very different. So this leaves us with the interpretation that the raw materials being used for the figurines from Liszt must have been made using a mixture of marl and Nile silts, or at least a less pure marl. While it's possible that the makers were taking two different clays and intentionally mixing them, it could also be naturally done by the river. As I told you at the beginning, the marl silts can be found on the fringes of the Nile Valley. So there are places where Nile silts and marl will be naturally kind of mixed by the river. So it could just be a natural mixing. It doesn't have to be an intentional one. So this is quite a difficult thing to untangle. But what's particularly interesting, actually, is that both geochemically, but also visually, all of these stylized zoomorphic figurines with the embedded faience beads are all incredibly similar. And they're so similar that they suggest the use of the exact same raw materials. Whereas other things are a bit more there's a bit more variation within them. These ones are all very, very similar. Okay, quickly, I just want to look at lahun on its own as well. So we can see here that a marl clay is definitely being used for these bird figurines, as I've said before. They're clearly outliers. They have higher calcite, calcium, and lower iron, very different from everything else we see. But there's also something else going on here, and we can see that there's a separation. There's a main cluster over here, and then these outliers over here. And these ones over here have higher iron and higher calcium. And I think that this might indicate that actually we have a different clay source or sources being used for some of the material from lahun. So when we want to think about what interpretations I can extrapolate from this data, the first main point is that the geochemistry suggests that the raw materials being used for figurines from lahun, buhen, and uranati are related. These are related clay sources. And this is due to their clustering together in the principal components analysis and when I look at the normalized data as well. The interpretation we can take from this is that the figurine makers at the sites were mainly utilizing clays close, from the Nile Valley, close to where they were living and making the objects. And the Nile flows really close to all of these sites, so it's a clear source that they would use and utilize. Uranati and buhen particularly cluster very close together, and this indicates the similarity of the materials being used for those two. Now, this doesn't come as much surprise when you consider that they are in the same part of Nubia, and they are quite fairly close proximity to one another. And also, there are no marl sources nearby, so they're clearly using this Nile clay, and that's reflected in the geochemical data. So the second point is that in general, people making these figurines were using local Nile silts that are close to their homes, but in a kind of informal basis. Now, I say this because there isn't really any suggestion of major standardization or specialized production. We don't see consistency, for example, in for example, Nile clays are going to be very, very heterogeneous. So some might have more they might have more minerals in them, not minerals, they might have more inclusions in them naturally, such as chaff or quartz, for example. And there isn't really any indication that they're taking out any of these or adding any. So there's not really any sense of kind of standardization or specialization taking place. But on the other hand, Lisht is a bit of a different story. So the chemical data, as well as what we can see from macroscopic study and the dynolite images, is that marl clay was heavily used at Lisht. In a few cases, such as with the figurines, those zoomorphic figurines with the faience beads, it's a major component to these artifacts. But the evidence indicates it was mixed also with a non-calcareous clay. It's not pure marl being used. Now, this is very interesting, given that both marl clay and Nile silts would have been very easily accessible to the people living at Lisht. And it suggests a conscious choice. Again, going back to the reasons why people use certain raw materials, it suggests there's a conscious choice to use a certain raw material. When you have a couple of options to choose from, it's important when you choose to use a certain one. So this could have been made for aesthetic reasons, practical reasons, like I said before, or functional reasons. One thing that I considered was the fact that we have these faience beads often embedded into the surface, and having a whiter clay might have been more striking when you're adding these faience beads. It's just a theory, but it's a possibility. So they might have chosen it for aesthetic purposes. So the fourth interpretation is that while then in general we have the production of figurines is more casual, there is one suggestion that we have more specialization or standardization in production, and that is with these faience figurines. So again, you can see all these figurines down here. They're so compositionally and aesthetically similar that it indicates that they may have been made by the same person within the same workshop, or within a small group of people, either over a period of time or in some sort of activity that may be related to the faience workshop or a specific workshop. Now, one possibility that they may be associated with this faience workshop where we found the clay lumps, and this is because the faience beads that are found in the clay lumps, it's like hundreds of these beads are found in this faience workshop. So were people that were working in this workshop using leftover clay, leftover marl clay, mixing it with something else, and then adding these beads to them to make these distinctive figurines? It's a possibility, it's theory. It's something that would have to be kind of proven. And one way to do that would be to analyze the faience beads and to see whether or not they were made in the same place, for example. But it's an interesting possibility. But what's more interesting is the fact that we have a suggestion that there's two types of production going on here. One which is more formalized or more systematic, and that is Licht, and it's associated, interestingly, with funerary contexts. However, on the other hand, we have another type of production which seems more informal, more personal, more ad hoc, and that's associated with personal use, and that's from the objects from Lahun, Buhen, and Uranati. So nearly done. So as I previously hypothesized, that there might be a group of figurines that have higher calcium and iron at Lahun, and this may indicate a different clay source being used or a different clay deposit. So when we look at a geological map of the area, we can see the special location of Lahun between the Nile Valley and the Fayum. It's not that far-fetched to consider that a number of different clay sources may have been used, and this might be influencing this geochemical spread. There would have been clay sources available to the north and also to the west of the site, as well as from the Nile Valley to the east. I would suggest the possibility that these outliers may have been made from these other clay sources, especially as they differ in their trace elements, as I was speaking about earlier. I don't think it's being utilised to the same extent as the Nile clays, but it was being used. And again, further, if we did some geochemical analysis of clay raw materials, we'd be able to kind of identify this a lot better. So finally, the last interpretation is that there is an indication that certain materials were chosen specifically for crocodile figurines. Again, there's only two examples of this, but I would hope to be able to study a few more. We'll go back to the other ones and see if there's any indication of those. And this is because of their grouping in the principal components analysis plot, but also the added mica that was added to two of those figurines. So obviously I need to extend this a bit further to kind of justify these interpretations, but it's an interesting possibility. So what I hope I've been able to demonstrate today is that from a collection of quite crude and fragile objects or fragile pieces of clay, it is possible to extract important data that can help to contextualize the way they were made with which raw materials, and also gain insight into the everyday lives of the people that made them. Figurine production was obviously an important activity for many people and something they took time out of their normal day-to-day lives to do. It shows a knowledge of and a connection to local raw material sources. They were very aware of the materials available around them. And these locations were not just used, importantly, these locations are not just used for potters for making, formalized ceramics. The geochemical spread suggests an informality with production, but there are certain objects such as the marl birds and the crocodiles that does suggest that in some cases there were active choices being made in the type of clay or other materials being used. So there's a lot of data to go through. There's still a lot more potential for what I can do with this data, especially if we acquire geological samples. I can definitely do a lot more. But I hope this has been an interesting overview of what I've done in the last year. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good. Now stay there. Maybe we have some questions from. I have some questions.
Yeah. Okay.
But first, any of you has any questions or any curiosity? You can speak, but probably enough.
The example that you just said, you have time to do so now, but I was wondering if you consider the provenance of evidence within the sites Because, for example, at Lagoon, I was wondering if the different clay composition may be related to the different the western and the eastern portions of the city. And also, Alicia was curious about the last figures you showed us, the faience beads, because I was wondering where they found and if they were used then as a traded good after production, so the deposition pathways of figurines.
Yeah, so so firstly with Lahun, that is something I want to do. That's kind of my next stage. I'm going to have a look at the contexts in which they were found, because that's going to be really interesting to see if there is any patterning there, something I haven't had time to do yet. For the list material, they were mostly finding these funerary kind of cemetery contexts. So it does indicate that they've been moved from their place of production to their final deposition place. And that's really interesting, because a lot of the other ones, we can maybe assume they were made and used in the same place where they were found. They're found within houses and or rubbish tips associated with houses. So yeah, I hope that answers it.
That was part of the project, but it's difficult to go to Lahun directly to sample the clay, because
Actually, there's also another point as well. Sorry, with Lahun, unfortunately, when Petrie excavated, he wasn't so good at keeping records of where he found things. So actually, trying to pinpoint the find spots for a lot of these objects is quite difficult as well. So it's something I'm going to be looking into, but I don't know how much I'll be able to do.
yeah, question. I have just some. Sorry. What? Okay.
Just a quick note on the problem. I don't know if you are considering, but there are some textual passages in healing papyri that prescribes the realization of clay figures of problems. And I think that they are already in the ancient papyri. Usually they are combined also with very precious material.
Yes.
Which I think that is unlikely that they were always disposable for this kind of rituals. So probably the choice of certain kinds of materials was a way to enhance the value of the objects even without having the practical material. Yeah, this is really interesting. So this is the kind of context I've been trying to, is my next step of looking, because I'm not an Egyptologist by trade. You know, I've done my undergraduate, I did a lot of Egyptian stuff, but this is the kind of detail that I'll need to, you know, especially with working with you, Gianluca, and other people to get these kind of ideas that what those symbolic kind of meanings might be. So thank you so much for that. That's really, really useful.
Yeah, that goes directly to my question or observation, because it's not a question, but you said that there is no real distinction between anthropomorphic and zoomorphic. That is quite striking, because we noticed that in the manufacture, as we published with Vanessa Forte, there is a participation of children in the manufacture of the zoomorphic figurines, while in the anthropomorphic ones there is no participation of children, which already gives sort of division between the two type of categories. And I expected to find division also in the raw material, while there isn't. So it's an open question. Because we just had an idea that the clay figurines were just impromptu. It was just something quick done. They were playing with clay and they were made these figures, but actually it's not true, because there is a rituality on some of them. Some others might be this, but we can't see directly with our eyes. But I hope that this could have given a bit more distinction, while it doesn't in this moment. Just I see that what you called mace head, that is wrong in the Egyptological literature. They are wombs of female. So there is a ritual behind this, and I'm happy to see that you were able to cluster them outside of.
Okay, that's very interesting. Oh, right. Okay, that's cool.
As well as I have the question that at one point you show all the figurines, all the material from Lahun, and you saw that pottery and the rat trap, they were a bit outside of the scheme, but while the figurines, they look more clustered in a point. It means that it's possible that they use specific clay for figurines, while for other artifacts they use different clay.
Yeah, I mean, it could suggest a few different things. I mean, as I briefly mentioned, when you fire clay, it does change its chemical properties. So there is certainly some part of it is to do with that. But yeah, I mean, I think that it is potentially showing that maybe not using different clays, but different processes in the use of the clay. So when you're making ceramic, for example, you're going to be much more careful about taking or adding temper, because when you're firing an object, you're increasing the stresses on it by heat and pressure. So you want to make sure that it's going to, withstand being put into a kiln. So you might take out certain inclusions that are going to kind of affect that, and also add them in if you need to. So it could be those processes, or it could be they could be cleaning the clay, levigating it, trying to make it purer. Also, it affects the texture of the object. So if you're making a bowl, you don't want it to have loads of kind of bumps in it. So you want to kind of take out these larger inclusions. So that's all going to affect the chemical kind of data that we're looking at. So it could be a number of reasons. Yeah.
Some other question? Okay, I just curiosity, it's the mica mineral that you saw, which is quite interesting. It's possible that that's been removed from other figures. There were also on other figures that's been removed, or just where you notice this is that?
No, so with mica, I've noticed mica in a lot of the objects, but it's smaller, it's more broken up, which, when you're preparing a clay, you often kind of bash it up, grind it up to try and kind of homogenize it a bit more, and that'll break up the minerals, but also it could just be naturally smaller within the deposits. What was interesting about those two figurines is that it's large mica. So I feel like they're finding it, they're taking it from elsewhere where you can find these large mica crystals, and they're intentionally adding to it. Especially with that the really nice crocodile figurine from Università, it was only on one side. It's only on the front. So they're adding it intentionally, kind of to represent something, I think, rather than it just being a coincidence in the materials. And the fact that it's in other objects but in smaller quantities and smaller size, these are the reasons that I think it's an intentional addition.
Yeah, this is what we noticed while working with the Hotep project. We noticed in Egypt, it doesn't matter if it's made of gold, entire gold, it needs to shine.
Yeah.
So this is the main point. So they used golden foil everywhere, even on Tutankhamun. I mean, they need to shine. It doesn't matter if it's wooden covered by gold, or it's clay covered by some material that is shining. This is quite a nice observation.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting.
It is. Okay, we have a question over there.
Just wondering if there are any indication of how mica was applied to the figurines.
How it would be applied. So mica would just be applied after the forming of it, because it's being, it looks to me like it's being not added to the clay in totality. It's adding just to the surface. So I think it would just be, while the clay was still wet, but the figurine has been formed, just adding it to the surface potentially. But it's something I need to look at a bit closer, because I haven't done too much work on that yet. But it's a good point.
So, okay, thank you again, Anna.
Thank you.